This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Can I introduce, first of all, Sue Anderson, and who will be accompanied hopefully fairly shortly by Sid Sparrow, for the paper, A History of the Task Force Aboriginal Higher Education Program, 1973 to 2013 in the University of South Australia. Now, Sue lectures at Dukia in Australian history and Australian studies. And Sue has worked previously as an archaeologist, historian and cultural consultant, primarily with Indigenous communities over some 20 years. And she's also a past president of the Oral History Association of South Australia. And perhaps I'll introduce Sid now, because he may come in as we're proceeding. And Sid, of course, is very well known in South Australia as a Ngarrindjeri Corny from the lower Murray and Coorong regions of South Australia. He's from a legal background, and Sid has been an academic with the David Uniacke College of Indigenous Education and Research at UniSA for some time. And Sid has been active, very active in Aboriginal affairs in South Australia and nationally since the 1980s. And he's currently chairperson of the State Aboriginal Heritage Committee and Kururu Youth Performing Arts Centre. So I've combined with this paper, which is going to be presented by Sue. Thanks very much, Sue.
Thanks very much, Jude. Well, yes, thanks very much, Jude. I would just like to begin by acknowledging that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land, and pay respects to the custodianship and the cultural attachment to the land that the Kaurna people have, and respect to the elders today and of yesterday. Since this paper was submitted for the conference, several things have changed. Firstly, I realised that I only have 20 minutes, so the title has changed from the whole of the history of the task force to the early years. And secondly, both Sharon Ma and Dr. Jared Thomas, who were originally down as authors of this paper, have since left the university, and I gather were not available today to join the talk. So it's just me and hopefully Sid when he arrives. Sid is, as Jude said, a Ngarrindjeri man, and he's been working at South Australia, in Uni of South Australia for some time, and he was a former student of the task force, so his knowledge in this particular project is invaluable, and I hope he makes it on time so that he can field some questions at the end. Okay. As the title suggests, the Aboriginal Task Force was the first dedicated national Indigenous tertiary education program in Australia, and the model for the establishment of Indigenous programs at other Australian universities. The task force was established at the South Australian Institute of Technology, Sept, in 1973, a predecessor institution of the University of South Australia, and was so successful it attracted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students from around the country. This paper is one preliminary result of what is to unfold into a major research project on the history of the Aboriginal Task Force. A team of academics from the David Uniacke College of Indigenous Education and Research, Dukia, began this research earlier this year with seed funding from History SA and the University of South Australia's Division of Education, Arts and Social Sciences Research Fund. The political climate of the era is particularly relevant. It's no coincidence that a program such as the Aboriginal Task Force emerged in 1973 in South Australia. The year 1970 heralded a radical new era in Australian politics. Don Dunstan had been returned as Labor Premier of the state in June, and his political reforms, including those in relation to Indigenous issues, were unprecedented at the time and are now legendary. Then in 1972, Gough Whitlam's government swept to power federally, bringing policy and fiscal support to the programs Dunstan sought to introduce. A socially progressive reformer, Dunstan quickly recognised Aboriginal land rights, amongst other radical reforms. Further, we know from the oral evidence of the task force's first academic head, Dr. Ross Harris, a psychologist, that Dunstan took a personal interest in the progress of the task force, as he did with other Indigenous initiatives, and that he visited often to join the students for drinks at the pub. Until this time, only a few Aboriginal people had completed tertiary degrees, the first being Charles Perkins, who I'm sure you'll all have heard of, who graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Sydney in 1966, followed by his cousin John Moriarty in 1970 from Flinders University. The way for this sort of education had been paved in South Australia when Paul Hughes graduated in 1965 with a teaching certificate, and Professor Paul Hughes is still associated with this university. The political environment was also influenced by international influences. In the early 1970s, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were influenced strongly by the African American civil rights movement, particularly between 1955 and 1968 in the American South. This social movement aimed at outlawing racial discrimination against black Americans and restoring voting rights to them. Its most notable leader was, of course, Martin Luther King, who became a national icon in the history of American progressivism for his role in the advancement of civil rights using non-violent civil disobedience. The strategy of public education, legislative lobbying and litigation that had typified the civil rights movement during the first half of the 20th century broadened to a strategy that emphasised direct action, primarily boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides, marches, and similar tactics that relied on mass mobilisation and peaceful resistance. This swell of black pride was embraced in Australia, and early students of the Aboriginal Task Force all attest to the fact that they were aware of this movement, that they embraced it, and that they developed their own. So the first united and politically organised all-Aboriginal activist group in Australia was the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, begun in 1924 under the leadership of Frederick Maynard. This was the first time Aboriginal people voiced their views collectively in public. They opened offices in Sydney, conducted public meetings, held street rallies, gained newspaper coverage, wrote letters and petitions to government at all levels, and collaborated with the international Black Labour movement. However, from the 1960s, a newer form of Indigenous activism surfaced. This was largely led by Charlie Perkins, whose tertiary education was pivotal in many ways to his taking this role. He was a strong supporter of the Aboriginal Task Force, which demonstrates his belief that a tertiary education for Indigenous people was beneficial for Indigenous students and communities. And that's Charlie Perkins showing his support for the Aboriginal Task Force by speaking at the 10th anniversary conference in 1983. As a third-year art student at Sydney University in 1964, Charlie Perkins founded an association called Student Action for Aborigines to help plan a freedom ride along the lines of those undertaken in the United States. The members of the group arranged a bus tour of Western and coastal New South Wales country towns. They aimed to raise awareness of the deficiencies in Indigenous health, housing and education, and challenge discrimination against Aboriginal people in rural communities. The students were shocked at the living conditions of Aboriginal people and the level of racism they encountered. They were met with violence, the bus at one point being run off the road. The publicity received also shocked city dwellers, by far the majority of the population, and no doubt influenced the public 90.77% vote in the 1967 referendum in favour of counting Indigenous Australians in the census and being subject to special legislation by the government. So this swelling activism was occurring at the same time as a wider call for political change was mounting. The federal Liberal Menzies government had been in power for nearly 20 years, and the Conservative platform was beginning to be challenged. Menzies' oratory skills had not been matched during his long term of office until Gough Whitlam hit the campaign trail for the Labor Party on the slogan "It's time for change" for the 1972 election. It's within this political milieu that the Aboriginal Task Force program emerged. The establishment of the Aboriginal Task Force was formally announced by Premier Dunstan in an election policy speech on community welfare made in February 1973. In April 1973, the program began in a very modest way as the Aboriginal Worker Training Scheme in the Department of Social Studies at the South Australian Institute of Technology, funded by the State Department of Community Welfare. It was initially designed to be a one-off 2-year skills-based program to provide South Australian Aboriginal community workers with qualifications commensurate with the duties they were already performing in the workforce. The aim of the training scheme was to train a task force of Aboriginal workers able to ascertain Aboriginal community needs in South Australia and to communicate these needs back to the Department of Community Welfare. Graduates from the training program, it was believed, would be able to assist the department in its consultation with Aboriginal groups in the community and thereby facilitate the better delivery of welfare services. The impetus for the program was the pressure placed on DCW by members of the Aboriginal community in South Australia who deeply resented being mainstreamed following the closure of the South Australian State Department for Aboriginal Affairs. When this closure occurred, all Aboriginal welfare recipients were transferred to DCW, and this caused considerable disquiet in the Aboriginal community. While the project's establishment can be attributed to the politics of Don Dunstan, it owes its establishment to the South Australian Institute of Technology's director, Dr. I don't know how to pronounce it, Aylwin Evans, and to the vision of Marie Moon, head of Department of Social Studies at Sept, who was the prime mover in the development of the program. Coinciding with a significant shift in Aboriginal affairs policy, which emphasised Aboriginal autonomous self-determination rather than more efficient welfare delivery, an advisory committee was established to assist in designing the program during the planning stage in 1972 in consultation with Marie Moon. Members included Paul Hughes, who was the chairperson, Lowitcher O'Donoghue, who I'm sure everybody knows of, Mona Tur, George Tongri, John Moriarty, Muriel Vanderbilt and Val Power as Indigenous representatives, together with one or two non-Indigenous departmental representatives. And all of those people are extremely well known in the Aboriginal community in South Australia and a lot of them nationally as well. So there's Lowitcher in the day, in the latest fashions. And there's Muriel Vanderbilt at a graduation ceremony. When the program began, it was staffed by a senior lecturer in charge, Dr. Ross Harris, a part-time secretary, Helen Jones, and a part-time lecturer, coordinator of studies, Dr. Olga Gostin. And Olga is still with Duckia as an adjunct, so she has been able to give us a lot of advice and input as well. In late September 1973, following the resignation of Gostin on maternity leave, a second lecturer, Peter Bleeby, was appointed to the staff. The very first intake of students and staff in 1973 was essentially trialling the program, which was in the experimental stage. Ross Harris had recently returned from a term in the United States where he'd become familiar with the civil rights and Black Power movements there, but otherwise had no experience with Aboriginal people and issues until he pushed open the doors of the Brookman building on Adelaide's North Terrace. It was very much a learning experience for everyone. From 1974, the program was supported by Commonwealth funding after the Whitlam government moved to assume full responsibility for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. In accordance with this policy, the Australian Department of Aboriginal Affairs was established, and federal spending on Aboriginal health, housing, employment and education was increased. The 1974 funding also covered additional part-time and sessional lecturers, library resources and equipment and travel expenses to bring students to Adelaide. This boost in staff numbers and support affirms the success of the first year of the program. In 1975, David Hope succeeded Ross Harris as head of the Aboriginal Task Force. While both men had great enthusiasm for the program, David Hope had previously worked in the Anangu Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara lands in the Northern Territory in the north of South Australia, which was an additional asset. Mary Ann Bin Salek, the first Aboriginal person to qualify in nursing in the Northern Territory, was appointed student counsellor. Mary Ann's now Emerita Professor of the Charles Darwin University, I beg your pardon. Rosemary Burden became the librarian and her sister Jenny a lecturer. Together with the secretary Helen Jones, they nurtured the students, particularly the younger ones, as did lecturer Glenn Valance. And this is Mary Ann in the middle with the afro, popular at the time. From its inception through its special entry program, the Aboriginal Task Force provided a means of entry to SAYET for Indigenous students who lacked essential prerequisites for entry into tertiary level institutions. This is the second intake in 1975, and some of the people here have been interviewed fairly recently. On the far right is Dr. Wayne Atkinson from Monash University and now at Melbourne University. So a number of them went on to become prominent academics. This is the same group on graduation, and they were the first Aboriginal Task Force students to receive an accredited tertiary qualification. However, for the next 10 years, David Hope also worked towards a further goal of aboriginalising academic staff, effectively doing himself out of a job. As a result, in 1987, the ATF became independent, the School of Aboriginal and Islander Administration within SAYET. Under the leadership of Professor Colin Burke, SAYET continued to expand and provide Indigenous students the opportunity of studying in all disciplines of SAYET. This led to the establishment of the David Unipen College of Indigenous Education and Research at the University of South Australia, which today represents excellence in Indigenous scholarship at the tertiary level in Australia. So how was it for the students? Many of the early students were people who had been keen to enter tertiary education but did not have the resources or ability to do so. Torres Strait Islander Ivy Aragu, 17 years old in the 1977 student intake, states that, "I had always been interested in going to university, but my parents couldn't afford it. And when that advertisement came up, and it was an opportunity for me to try and get it, and I took it, and I was really, really over the moon when I got accepted." And here's Ivy talking about her experience.
Economic position. Some of the horrendous social history that was attached to our people. But I think it made me stronger because the environment that Task Force created at that time was a safe environment for us to talk about those sorts of things without very little emotional impact on us as adults. And I think that this was my introduction to be politically astute, politically aware, and politically active on some of the issues about our people. And for the 2 years that I was here, this place built me up. It prepared me for what I do today. It would take me 10 years after that to complete my university degree.
Okay, I'll skip a bit here for time reasons. Former students talk of the joy of learning, not only from the lecturers, but from their fellow scholars about the different Indigenous cultures. They also recount the activism that developed amongst them that drove them in their future endeavours. For Margaret Crompton, first student intake, it was a big thing, quote, for people to be starting to fight for their rights after the 67 referendum. I was involved with a lot of early stage marches and that type of thing. A lot of this is attributed to the separate safe space they enjoyed in the enclave, where they were free to share ideas and opinions without fear of reprisal. The early students bonded closely. People who had been denied some of their basic human rights from birth were now finding themselves in a position where they had the opportunity to exercise power and take the lead instead of being repressed, regulated and controlled. With knowledge came self-confidence and desire to rectify the wrongs of the past. Students also protested proactively. Street theatre was a means of informing the public about Indigenous issues, and students performed at prominent locations in Adelaide, where they often drew considerable crowds. Oh, that's Ivy again. This is the Streets Theatre. For most of the students, it was a very steep learning curve and a hard slog. However, there were good times. Sorry, there's another street theatre there. This is Ivy in the middle. The theatre is based on the Stolen Generations, which didn't even have a name in those days, and they're acting it out in Rundle Mall, and they had quite a big crowd. However, there were also good times. Not only did they study together, but students socialised together on a regular basis. There were barbecues in each other's homes. Many students were talented musicians, artists and performers. There was a task force band that entertained at functions around Adelaide. Social occasions between students and staff also provided venues for these talents to be shared, which added to the bonding experience that took place amongst them. Later, field trips to places of significance such as Lake Mungo, the APY lands and Alice Springs eventuated, and the History Project team continued to investigate further through oral history testimonies of those who experienced these years. On conclusion, there's one final aspect of the task force that we couldn't have imagined. Not only were lifelong friendships established, but lifelong partnerships were formed. To date, we're aware of at least 4 lasting marriages arising from the 1977 intake alone. Tom Calmer describes meeting his wife Heather. Oh, what did I do? Top. Sorry, where you are, jump on, you can see PowerPoint. Oh, thank you. There's the band. And this is Tom Calmer.
I had this great dog called Beaumont, a German short-haired pointer who travelled with me everywhere. And I went down to Tatachilla, and Heather was on the organising committee, and I went in to register with my dog, and and I can remember this, standing on the stairs going, "Hey, you can't have that dog here." And I go, "Whoa, what do you mean I can't have that dog here?" She says, "It's in the rule book." I thought, "Oh, very good." So I went out, looked up the rule book, wasn't there. I should have learnt from that first encounter, you know. Challenge this woman, but yes, it wasn't in the rule book. So she ate humble pie, and we got on pretty well together. In fact, we end up getting on very, very well together, and are still together some 35 or so years later.
And there they are in 1978, and that's Tom Calmer today. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sue. Any questions?
Oh, Jill.
I just wanted to ask, so was it set up specifically for South Australia and Northern Territory, or was it always intended to be a national project? There seem to be so many different older countries.
Well, there are. This was the first of its kind in terms of the national perspective. It started as a training program just for South Australian social workers or community workers, but it was very successful that first year. Although they actually took in Western Australians as well, and 2 people from the Northern Territory. Garchel Jerkara was one of the 1973 student. So although in 1972 when they were planning it, they were planning to actually just take in South Australian community workers, the interest got out there and people heard about it and wanted to come. So, yes, there were 3 people from the Northern Territory and 4 from Western Australia, and the rest were from South Australia in the first intake. So, from the start, it was a national program. Mm. Elaine.
Is a component of this research that was a big musical program over here in South Australia? Because a lot of West Australians came to a music program, an Aboriginal music program.
Karma. Yes, some did. Stephen Albert came to Task Force, and then he went back, of course, he was a performer and he was in Brand New Day. He went first from Task Force. He didn't finish because he was headhunted by the Commonwealth Government, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and he went there and earned the huge salary of $23,000 in 1977, which was, quite controversial, but obviously they recognised his abilities, and so there were a lot of success stories like that. But yes, people did come to Karma as well. Yeah. Up the back, perhaps? No? No, that's okay.
Thank you very much.